Today is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Biao Xiang to join us and share with us his observation and insights of the nearby, a scale to be reconsidered in contemporary urban China. I will start with a short introduction of Professor Xiang, and he will give us his presentation following the Q&A session hosted by me and my co-convener Karam. If anyone have any questions along the talk, please write it down in the chat box or the Q&A column, and we are happy to address it afterwards. So Biao Xiang is professor of social anthropology at the University of Oxford and director of Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. Biao has worked on various types of migrations in China, India, and other parts of Asia. He is the winner of the 2008 Anthony Lees Prize for his book Global Body Shopping and the 2012 William L. Holland Prize for his article Predatory Princess. His 2000 Chinese book 跨越边界的社区, published in English as Transcending Boundaries, was reprinted in 2018 as a contemporary classic, and his Self-as Method, co-authored with Wu Qi, is ranked #1 most impactful book in China last year. Xiang's work has been translated into Japanese, French, Korean, Spanish, German, and Italian. And today there's already a large group of audience for this talk, and I'm sure many of you have encountered his works. So without further ado, now I will pass the screen to Biao, and Biao, the floor is yours.
Okay, unless Carlo have something to say or you want to join later. No, okay, thank you very much. I mean, it's a really great pleasure to be able to talk to you about quite a tentative idea, but which is quite exciting to me. And it is exciting precisely because it's quite experimental. And it's not a strictly academic idea, but also I wanted to make it into kind of experimental movement. Probably start with art movement first, and you can laugh, but you can see whether or not it work. So I would like to start with COVID. I mean, coronavirus, of course, people say, oh, it's an enemy of the entire humanity. And you would think that the a common enemy of humanity would bring us a strong solidarity across all humankind. But I suppose it's quite clear coronavirus has deepened divides between all kinds of groups at all different levels rather than enhance solidarities. You have corona nationalism at the international level, and also you have breakdown of friendship within the WeChat moments, which is social media circles because of different views. Then why that is the case? And such a paradox, right? On one hand, it is supposed to be enhancing solidarity, but in reality, it deepens divides. Of course, it's not caused by coronavirus itself. Rather, it should be attributed to a more general pattern of meaning making. At least this is so in China. I'm just focused on the Chinese case. This pattern of meaning making has one characteristic that is the meaning are increasingly driven from two extremes. And one extreme is personal, immediate material gains. And this determines what activities you should take and what kind of decision, practical decision you should make, including whom you marry, date, and what kind of job you should apply for. And then there's the other extreme is global affairs on a very grand scheme and often is tied to geopolitical power play. For example, the US-China relations, and which again, I mean, in turn, are often related to certain ideological stance. So these two extremes, on one hand, it's immediate personal material. On the other hand, it is a big global issues often expressed in quite abstract and moralized, so therefore often essentialized terms. So people oscillate between the two when they perceive the social world. And what lies between the two, namely the place or the space where everyday interactions unfold, for example, meet your neighbors and your colleagues, and that part, of course, exists, but it is hollowed out as a source of meaning. You don't derive meaning from that daily interactions. Right? It exists. So that's for people, if they're anthropologists in the audience, this actually is quite similar to what Jane Gaia described in her analysis about the temporal perception or the public perception of time in the US after 1970s. And she described that situation in the US as the evacuation of the near future, meaning that the people either are worried about what is immediate, what something is immediately available opportunities or some problems that need immediate solution, or the people think a very long term, I mean, which is related to a quite extreme neoclassical economics or even neoliberal economics. Basically, everything will work out if you give time to market. So therefore, the near future, which is like probably 5 to 10 years time, which is a socially meaningful period of time when you can make concrete changes. That part is evacuated from the kind of bipolarization or polarization of temporal order in our perception. So I think that's in China, it's what happened probably can be described as the hollowing out or the empty out of the nearby. So therefore, in this today's talk, I just want to explore whether or not we can develop a vision of nearby, not as a concrete space yet, but as a scale of seeing. I mean, the title of the talk, I called it the scale of knowing. But after thinking about a little more, I think probably a scale of seeing is more accurate than a scale of knowing. Knowing implies the kind of conscious, planned information collection and analysis. Seeing is a more direct and even more effective, right? It's involve your effects and immediate interactions, less systematic and more spontaneous. So as a scale of seeing. So let me explain what do I mean by nearby, what I mean by scale, and what I mean by seeing. It is important to emphasize that the nearby is very different from the neighborhood, especially now. Probably that's the key point of this talk. Today in urban China, neighborhood is not at all neglected. Neighborhood is a new front line, is a new battlefield. The government and the companies are very interested in developing communities. And we will come back to this point later. But nearby means that you have to step out from the gate of a condominium, which is the main type of space that most urban residents live now. You have to step out from the very ordered condominium, and you have to talk to the people selling vegetable next to the gate. And of course, you also should talk to the security guard who is looking, guarding the gate. Actually, there are lots of diversity inside of the condominium as well. You have cleaners, you have domestic helpers, you have repair workers. So the idea of nearby is to engage with all these different people that are physically close to you, but probably are socially very different in terms of status, or ideologically have different orientations. So in this sense, the nearby is meant to be a how to say, counter concept of this condominium style community or neighborhood. And then what do I mean by scale? So therefore, I mean, as I emphasized, nearby is meant to transgress the administratively defined boundaries. So therefore, the nearby is never given. Nearby has to be constructed. This also means the nearby is very different from a community in the sense it is not a unit because it does not have its own boundary. It actually should be open. And so nearby is not a level, because being a level means that you have to be part of a predefined system, right? You have the level of a community, then above the community, in the Chinese urban system, you have the unit called, the level called the street, 街道. Then above the so-called street as a level of the administrative unit, then you have the district, and then above that is a municipality or city, depends on the size of the city. So level is predefined, but the nearby is not as part of predefined system. It is constructed according to your own daily activities, and also very much according to what you want to see. So then scale. By scale, I mean it's a scope in which you carry out your daily interactions, and therefore it becomes a basis on which you collect information, and a basis or a scope in which different opinions and different experiences are brought together. And it is a scale in the sense that it is in the nearby, you can establish interreferencing points, because you meet these domestic helpers and you know her life history and has a child in the countryside. And then you also talk to the person who is a security guard, and then you have a person, but your neighbor, of course, you need to talk to your neighbor, and the neighbor can be very rich. And then you have a person who open a restaurant, but now is really suffering because the food online, food purchase and delivery became the main thing, and the restaurant is declining, and also the grocery shop in next to the community, next to the condo, now also are being turned into almost like a delivery center for these online platform companies. The grocery shops are not selling much of their own goods, but they are just are used as a point where the delivery companies will deposit the goods there, and then the individual customers will come to pick up their goods. So therefore, you see the conflicts, different views and positions among all these people, and then their views shed a line on each other, enable you to understand how your social world is constituted in a very concrete manner. And when some question arise, for example, how coronavirus should be handled, or how should China's education policy reformed, then naturally this different point of view will emerge from your mind. So therefore, you will no longer regard yourself as the same as the world. As I mentioned earlier, there is a polarization of this meaning-making scheme. You have this self, and then suddenly jump to the global affairs. I mean, you talk to educated young people in Chinese cities, often they get this impression. They wouldn't be able to give a very clear account about their nearby, but they have very direct, concrete worries about job, marriage, buying house. And then they have very strong opinions about China's position in the world and the US, etc. And actually, it's a create a sense almost as a self is a world, right? And the coronavirus is so divisive precisely because it is on one hand directly related to your physical health. And at the same time, it is supposed to be global. So it is something, expressed in a very universal and global terms. So you create a feeling that yourself is the world. And whoever disagree with you, it will become, it's become the enemy of the world. There is such an antagonism going on, especially you read the debates on social media. It's quite taxing, actually. You read the comments there. So the nearby as a scale of seeing, they try to redress such a problem, right? You talk to these different people, and it's not only there are different people out there, but you let the different people's view shed light on each other. So therefore, the point of interreferencing point, you take this view as a reference point to another in order to understand how the social world is constituted. So therefore, the idea of scale. So scale, by doing that, this scale will generate new understanding. This is a kind of my probably quite idiosyncratic definition of a scale. I think we call something scale is because it will give you something extra, have will generate additional capacity for action or for understanding, right? I mean, in an early article, I talk about is a scale of action. You look at Facebook or now WeChat or Al Qaeda. Why they are so powerful? Actually, they don't really own much asset, nor do they run any tangible institution that really subjugate you. They are powerful because they have developed large scale of connection, of coordination and operation. So that is a scale give them power. It's rather than any tangible. So now today I'm talking about the scale is not a scale of operation or action, but it's a scale of seeing. So I want to say that once you put all different things together and create a scale, it will give you extra capacity for understanding. Then seeing, nearby as a scale of seeing. Seeing, of course, it's to see what's going around here. And John Berger said, of course, seeing is different from looking. And this Aristotle's idea, carpenter has to see a chair in a piece of wood in order to make the chair, before they start any work. So a painter has to see a picture on the canvas before drawing any line. But you guys are architects, of course, you know much better than I do. I suppose the most important step in architecture design, one of the most important, probably is to see a building in a completely wasteland or empty space. So see is to see is to envision and to understand. But seeing is also especially important now in China, I think at least for 3 reasons. Number one is because the social contradiction in China actually are not antagonistic enough in everyday sense. Is not strong enough to trigger direct social actions. So the situation in the Chinese cities are quite different from, for example, in New York or even London. There's no large, of course, very different from Mumbai or Johannesburg. So we don't have a large scale of homeless people. And the disparity is not so much obvious, not obvious enough that you can mobilize any social movement and taking actions. So, the right to cities and rebel cities, this is probably languages have purchased in I think a more global north. I'm not less sure about you talking about the right to city or rebel city, whether or not making much sense to people in India. I don't know, but certainly in Beijing or Shanghai, it is a little difficult to persuade. I mean, people know there's problems, but not in this form, and certainly not to this extent. So the time of acting is not ready. So I think more important is seeing than acting. And then for second reason, the second reason I wanted to emphasize seeing is because I think in the Chinese cities now is also a bit too early to judge, to develop a certain ethics of conviviality. I mean, Richard Sennett, he said the very important feature of open city is this kind of indifference towards differences. Basically, you take differences as normal. I mean, don't make a fuss about it. I mean, he said, "Oh, you don't need to be friendly to anybody." I mean, but just that kind of traditional community probably is impossible anyway. But the most best thing is the indifferent. To be indifferent to differences. But I'm afraid in China now is not is that the stage yet, in the sense that uh, if you want to be indifferent to differences, it means that you have to be aware there's such differences. You have to recognize the differences. But now I think for many residents in urban China, probably this awareness itself is still lacking. So I have not reached to the stage of making ethical reflection about differences. So therefore, this cognitive question of seeing probably is more urgent than the ethical question of judging whether or not to be indifferent or which form of tolerance is more desirable. And the third reason that I want to emphasize seeing, here I mix my academic thinking and the social advocacy. I think if you look at the public debates in China, you often see people see things in things that they can't see. So I always say that, okay, we have to learn to see things in the things that we see, meaning that if you have opinions, it must have some empirical evidence to back up. And it means that your opinion must be at least associated. Not, I mean, it's difficult to prove everything, but it must have some experiential basis. So now I think that because of social media and etc., lots of ideological debate became debased or dissociated from empirical experiences, everyday experiences. So people often see things in things they don't see. It's through imagination. So I want to emphasize seeing is to urge everyone to open their eyes to their nearby, the surrounding. Don't do too much imagination, and don't be trapped by abstract principles and thinking, etc. So that is the what I mean by the nearby as a scale of seeing. So I would like to illustrate what it really looks like, the nearby as a scale of seeing, by mentioning two examples. And through these two examples, I want to emphasize that the nearby is really different from traditional community It's not attached to a fixed place, does not have any continuous history, and is not a custodian or defender of tradition. Rather, it can be very fluid, and it is very generative. I mean, that go back to my earlier point, is that the scale is meant to create something new, to be, to generate something. So therefore, generative. And the first example actually is my own childhood neighborhood. I want to use this example to demonstrate how fluid nearby can be. I mean, that actually existed nearby, but now the nearby, yeah, that's another point that we'll mention. That now I did use a word, the expression in Chinese public media to talk about the disappearance of nearby, but now I don't think disappearance is very accurate. Now nearby is being either displaced or programmed through all this community building and the last mile business. It's being programmed into something else. So it's not really gone physically, but it's turned into something else. But it did exist before. So the actually existed nearby is highly fluid. And the second example is coming from my field research about a garment making migrant community in Beijing in 1980s and early 1990s. And I want to use that case to say that the nearby can be very generative, not only cognitively, but also in terms of what actions that you can take. My childhood neighborhood, my childhood nearby or neighborhood was in a very poor community in Wenzhou. It's a city, so it's not countryside. It is most of the residents, including my own grandparents, were migrants from nearby countryside. And the most common occupation among our neighbors are porters who transport goods, especially grain, from a nearby river port to the warehouse. Actually, we live in a warehouse area. And they do that mainly by pulling wooden cart at that time. But this so many young audience have never seen them in their life. And so we live in a kind of 60 square meters, 2-story houses, which accommodate over 10 people. And there's no door downstairs. So unthinkable nowadays, but that was common. So therefore, lots of interactions with the next doors. And on one side, downstairs, it's very difficult to describe in words because it's very irregular, the structure of the living space. So there was one was a kind of underground prostitute, so which is, I mean, it's quite cruel when I was thinking about it. But she's constantly, of course, a topic for gossip and treated quite badly, by neighbors. And the other side of the family is this cart pulling family. So both the entire family work as cart pullers. And the father was alcoholic, and the two sons are constantly in and out of prison. And my most acute memory about them is domestic violence. We often just wake up in the middle of the night in horror because the scream, that kind of scream from their house. And then people had to rush in to break in their house for rescue. And yet, another next door neighbor is a party secretary of a top research institute in the city. And of course, the city is small. The research institute is nothing like Cambridge. But nevertheless, it's quite a high status. And the reason he became party secretary is because he was a very poor peasant. And then he joined the army after he retired from army, and he went through training. So he became a party secretary, and so he once he gave us this. My first time I tasted the gum because of him, and he took a flight. So on the airplane, so they were given gums. So I always thought the gum is airplane candy. So for a long time I called gum airplane candy because that is the association. As I established between gum and the airplane flight. And another neighbor was a artist and the sculpture. He made lots of sculpture, which whom actually did very well because later in 1980s, 1990s, the city building boom, and you need lots of sculptures standing here and there. So then my own grandparents, they were kind of foreign landlords. So therefore, they had some cultural superiority, but economically and socially, I mean, it's quite equal among all of them. And then, of course, so for me, that is a kind of scale because people, all different people, and we interact with each other very intimately. And a main topic at that time of conversation was politics. And there's lots of this, I mean, the people's education level was not high, but everyone listened to the, you know, the central, the central people's radio, and also read the newspapers. So constantly discussing history, particularly the Cultural Revolution. And of course, the main topic is all about the assessment of different political figures. You know, what do you think of Mao? What do you think of Liu Shaoqi and Deng? And then, of course, the ongoing reform as well. So there's a lots of discussion about politics. But what is amazing is that there's never kind of embarrassment. People have different opinions, and people are very frank about their differences. And I remember my uncle would tell the cadre, you know, oh, you will have different opinions because you are so fat already. I mean that he got the higher salary and etc. But people have the kind of sense of a humor to deal with these differences. And I think it's very different from today's political debates on social media. We can discuss that later. But this kind of verbal, face-to-face, it's not to declare your stance. It's really to talk, to hear what you say. And somehow whether or not you agree or not agree does not matter too much. As long as we talk about it, that's good enough. And then you always have other things that drop in, you know, I mean, what are you eating and what was, you know, the sound was so loud last night, etc. There's a thing that can go on. So that the discussion of politics was a main topic. And I emphasize this because this political awareness, the awareness that everyone went through very dramatic political changes, the awareness that these political changes have been responsible for the differences among everybody. And also the political changes have brought everyone together in this tight neighborhood. Actually create, in my view, of the foundation on conviviality. So people, of course, realize everyone's different and there is a clear inequalities among neighbors. But because you know how these differences are created, because these political changes, and also you have a sense that the situation is not very stable because the political changes are constantly up and down. There's lots of landlords suddenly become tenants, and then you have poor peasants raised to senior positions, and then he was kind of sometimes he was denounced during the earlier political campaigns before I was born. So it's a constantly up and down. People take the things is feel very fluid. Feel things are very fluid, and also there was a very important fact that nobody owned anything. Everyone was a tenant of the state in terms of accommodation. I mean, there's no property rights there, land property rights. So nobody has any private wealth. Of course, there is differences in who have a watch, who have bicycles. It's a minor difference, but it's not something like the possession as a family wealth. So that creates a sense of historical fluidity. In my view, that help to explain why we could live together. So it is that fluidity. Now I'm thinking back, make the neighborhood actually my first classroom of life as well as my first lesson of society. I can see the differences, and also I can see how people of different positions are interlinked, created by the same history. Yet the history, how unpredictable historical change can be. So that is as a skill of seeing for me, as a skill of seeing, and it becomes a skill because it is highly fluid inside. But from outside the point of view, you would think it's a very static kind of community because people's material life did not change at all for about 30 years until 1990s. But inside, how people are up and down, actually is a very remarkable. So therefore, the nearby as a skill of seeing is always a perspective from insiders. If you are outsiders, there's no such thing as a scale, because from outside point of view, there's only unit or level. Oh, that's kind of, you think it's a shapeless group of people. But the scale has to be constructed from inside out. The second example quickly is this group of migrant community who make garments, I mean, which will be probably more relevant to the theme of this series, the guild, the urban guild. I mean, they do form, in a sense, the urban guild in the sense that they make garments, and also they have certain internal rules, but not explicit, of course, implicit rules. They have their own way of running business. Let's put it that way. And so the curious question for many people is that this group of migrants, starting with 6 families in 1984, and they developed themselves into a community of 100,000 population and a major supply center of low-end garments for the entire North China by early 1990s. I mean, just about 10 years. I mean, how could this be possible? And what is more curious is the fact that the place that they occupied, let's say occupied, is about 6 kilometers south to Tiananmen Square, the very center of the capital and the very center of the entire China. So it was astonishing for many local cadres. And there's a very important reason that they could manage to do that is because now I'm imposing my analytical frame here, is because they have developed the capacity of seeing the neighborhood as a battlefield, and also take the nearby as a scale. So the reason that they can develop so quick, so fast, despite the repeated and regular governmental campaigns to chase them away, of course, especially before the National Day or before anything important, the government was sending in so-called work teams to, first of all, to persuade them to leave, and then later just chase them and confiscated their sewing machine and etc. The reason that they can always come back and they always found place to hide is because they saw lots of gaps, lots of discrepancies between the multiple institutions that own the land and housing in that neighborhood. Beijing, being Beijing, is an administratively especially complex place. You have central government agencies and ministries, many ministries. You have army, and army have different branches and different lines. Then you have Beijing municipal government, and then you have district government, under which you have a street, as I mentioned, 街道, and on the street you have residence committee for the urban part, and you have the villagers committee on the rural part, and then you still have township and the towns. So especially in that area, it's a lots of crisscrossing of different institutions, and these different institutions have different interests, and also they follow separate line of command. So therefore, for example, if the district launch a campaign wanted to cleanse these migrants, the army, the ministries, all these the municipal bureaus did not pay too much attention to the district government, and they can continue to host these migrants for rent. Of course, migrants pay the rent. There is an economic interest involved. And so this is for the same reason, the migrants could make deals with local institutions, either the village committees or some state-owned companies, and especially the factories that are not doing well economically, and they're very happy to rent out their large space for the migrants to build their own accommodations and their own marketplaces since the early 1990s. So that is a scale. The nearby as a scale, right? As a scale that you see all the differences, and furthermore, it became a scale of action because you can exploit the differences. It's not only differences as an interreferencing point for better understanding, but the differences as a gap, as a huge space that you can exercise your agency to create something new. So that is the two examples I want to emphasize, that the nearby as a scale can be very fluid and very dynamic and very generative domain. And I want to emphasize this is because now in China, there's no way for us to rescue the nearby, rescue all the community. No, our business is to create something new, because nothing you can return to. And then this kind of historical experiences, I hope it should be relevant for today's action. So then let me go quickly to the next point about how did this actually existed nearby apparently disappear. I want to emphasize this is only apparent phenomenon that they disappear. There's a reality that they are being reprogrammed. And I think three reasons are important. Number one, actually has a lot to do with the property rights regime, which was first introduced in urban China in mid-1980s through the government policy of returning previous private properties to the previous owners, the individuals, because I think it's 1958. Probably in different cities, slightly different. 1958, the state take over all these property rights from individuals, and then 30 years later, they returned. And I remember that well, because that single policy change really changed the dynamic in my childhood neighborhood, my childhood nearby. Because one of actually the artist, do you remember? The artist's father used to be a very poor fisherman, but for some reason he saved lots of money. I don't know, not lots of, I don't know, but they saved enough money to buy the houses. Then my family lived a part of that houses. But because, I mean, in the beginning, I think my family were paying rent to him, but in 1958, that was taken by the state. So everyone became tenants of the state. And then in the 1980s, so I mean, it took a while to implement the policy. And once that came through, the neighbors starting talking about, we should measure the size. And of course, you can always live here. We have been neighbor for so long time, but do you have any plan when you're going to move out? So, I mean, I was young, but I can sense that things become very delicate, and as the negotiation became rather painful. And the notion of property rights is so there's a it's a quite interesting to me is for two reasons. Number one is that nowadays we talk about this urbanization as a process of accumulation by dispossession, popularized by David Harvey, a very interesting idea that can explain the general history of capitalism and urbanization in many parts of the world. But I'm not sure it is very pertinent in the Chinese case. But if you look at in the formal sense, urbanization in China is not really dispossession. I mean, even for peasants, I mean, in the end, they did get fairly okay compensation in general. And then many people became, of course, owners of properties, first time in their life. In China, China now is number one in terms of household property ownership rate. 96% of urban households in China own properties, as compared to 65% in the US last year. So is this a process of dispossession, or is it a sense of democratization of asset? It's difficult to say. But yet, second reason that I feel is interesting is that if you look at the more deeply, look at the people's everyday life, property rights can be quite destructive. It is destructive, and again, for a number of reasons, but I just want to emphasize one, which was very well articulated by the anthropologist called Eric Harms through his ethnography studies in Vietnam. When you start talking about the property rights, when you start to measure the exact size of your house and then calculate how much compensation you should ask for as compared to the market price, it's all fine, it's probably the new right. But at the same time, you lose the language, and you even lose the aesthetics, lose the capacity of perceiving your home as a place where you dwell, where you live, right? Where you develop this very complex feelings, relations, and sentiment. His ethnographer basically said, when people talk about house, there's always a very dramatic shift from being very sentimental to very calculative and righteous. From talking about how the past life is like that, I mean, very vague language, nothing quantifiable, then everything become numbers, mathematics, because you have to measure and the size and the price and etc. So I think I have not found any very concise language to describe that, but I feel that is probably does tell us something about urban life in China as well. The whole notion of now being, if you look at the visual representation of the urban space, everything is precise, perfect geometry, well-defined, right? Everything is, of course, quantifiable and even now digitized, etc. So that kind of you conceive your life, express life through sentiments is regarded as a kind of very weak narrative. So I have my, I witness, I experience that. Because once the property rights regime came in, if you still talk about, oh, we used to be good friends, etc., it just sounds a very weak argument. People don't want to mention that. People even it's you lose that language altogether, lose that kind of mindset, lose that mode of living, and as well as you lose that mode of argumentation. Um, so then I call this kind of dispossession by possession. It's precisely by giving you a very strong sense of possessing property, you are deprived of. There's a cultural asset. You are dispossessed of the sentiments part of life. That is somehow my childhood nearby disappeared. I mean, when the company came to destroy that, no one felt sad because the feeling was gone a long time ago. The negotiation, the neighborhood, I mean, the neighbors were very kind. We were not kicked out at all. But that is always overshadowed by the question, how should we face that new relations as defined by property rights? The second development that reprogram the nearby into something else, of course, is the grid system. We don't have time going to. Is basically the Chinese government system to run communities. The grid is every a few, probably 10, more than 10, probably 20 household. It's a one group. You have a leader, and then at the higher level you have another leader. It's a kind of classical scale. This is a classical sense of scale going to build up. So make sure that every household is under this grid of management, and which is coupled with the commercial condominium management system, as well as coupled, on the other hand, with a party system, which is also have their own grid among party members. It's very well developed. Actually, I'm guilty, to some extent, I'm guilty about that, because based on my earlier research on migration, I probably was one of the first sociologists that proposed to develop a so-called community system as a way to move away from the so-called work unit system. That was in the late 1990s. But then this grid system really developed, not because of my suggestion, obviously not, but mainly because of Fa Runggong in the end of 1990s. But they did good. They put a lot of effort and are welcomed by many residents because they deliver security, right? And then related to that, another side is from 2015, you have this. Well, there are many names, but we can call it the community O2O, online, offline service model, food delivery, and all kinds of logistic service to your doorstep. And from 2015, shopping mall is no longer a target of investment or a growth engine in city at all. Actually, companies, capital shift their attention to community, to residential community. So therefore, there's a language of the last mile and then last 500 meter business coming. And then the third reason that how the nearby is programmed, reprogrammed, is the virtual online communication. Whether or not it's communication is a different question, but online entertainment and the transaction, right? Like TikTok emphasize a lot about the nearby stories. But what kind of nearby is being represented through TikTok? I want to probably hear your view as well, because probably you're more familiar with that. I think it's very interesting and very tricky. Is that kind of TikTok are really calling attention to nearby, or actually they are really distorting our perception of the nearby, at least in a way, is very different from what I wanted to advocate. Yeah, okay. So we're running time, and just the last 2-3 minutes to say what is the movement I wanted to promote. I want to promote the first mile movement. So the last mile is about how government and corporations reach down to the ultimate users. We are all users, all ultimate subject of regulation. So then the main means for carrying out the last mile business is, of course, logistical development, infrastructure, and technology, data, etc. So the first mile movement is to say, I mean, it's not a very scientific defined term, but it's meant to be provocative and to be counter movement to the last mile. So it starts from yourself, right? You pay attention to all the people, everything that around you in your first mile every morning you go to work. Then trace their histories, pay attention and to how everything come into being. Where did the former peasants who were working on this field went before the condominium was built, and who built it, and how it was sold, how much money was made, and what happened to the hair salon on your way to the bus stop, and etc. So the last mile, the first mile is meant to reach out and not let the powerful agencies reach down, but we reach out to the world. How to do it? I think, I mean, visual artists and architects have lots of to offer. So we don't have much. Yeah, I have some tentative idea, but we can discuss that later. I just want to share with you a couple of slides about a number of exhibitions that I know. Yeah. So this is, I mentioned, I hope it's not, you don't think I'm showing off, but I mentioned this nearby idea. I'm sharing screen, but completely black. 1 year ago in, why does it not allow me to go the first? In a TV station now, I just over last 1 year, I came across at least 4 art exhibitions that use that idea, but they all use the idea, the disappearance of nearby, which now I think it should be qualified. I just want to show you this. I mean, this is, they wanted to emphasize disappearance. But I mean, this one, and especially the last one, I thought it's interesting, is that the nearbys are, it's not really emphasize the disappearance, but it's really invite you to discover the multiplicity of nearby, right? Because there is a blank. Literally, they say the nearby is what? Then the last character means exhibition. So I really feel very excited by the possibility that the social scientists and artists and practitioners in design and of course community work can possibly work together and to train, to develop a new way of seeing, not for ourselves, but for residents in general, a way of seeing, a way of thinking, and therefore a way of action. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Biao, for such an interesting and very, very rich presentation of your work and your vision. We definitely need such visions for a world which seems to be like being divided, unfortunately, despite everything that is happening, despite the COVID crisis and all of that. So visions that offer opportunities are very much needed. So we can now receive questions from the audience. Please, if you have any questions, post them in the chat or send them through the Q and A. Yeah. So while people kind of gather their thought and think of their kind of questions, I just would like to highlight a few things that it's interesting that the vision of the neighborhood, like you said, is something to kind of regain the sentiment, maybe trying to think of space, meaning, time, and I'm just thinking how, like, when you kind of envision such an approach, and while also thinking of the our kind of well-established systems, like the way we construct space, the way the hierarchy of our cities. So did that, do you think a new vision should start from within the same system, or kind of suggest a new paradigm shift, like a new system shift? Like what where do you stand on that in a way? So when we think of the nearby and the neighborhood, like, do you see them as a in opposition of each other, or
Yeah, no, thank you. So I mean, I just can't imagine how we can change the system overnight. The system meaning that the private ownership-based housing regime, right? But there are experiments. Uh, the one case is called Dinghai Qiao in Shanghai, and it used to be a factory district set up by Japanese. I think probably even before 1930s, before the war. But then it became part of, it is a textile factory, and then it became a state-owned factories. And of course, then you have layoff. So therefore, the community, the former kind of factory dormitory space became quite poor and backward. It became very undesirable for the middle class citizens. And then very interesting thing happened. And the young people now experiment there, new way of living together, housing. So they have their own shared space for both the short term and the long term. I mean, cohabitation in the sense probably share kitchen and bathroom, and at the same time they use that space for arts exhibition and organize discussions and etc. So that could, I mean, of course, I mean that can no way change the system, but they explore a way of living without possessing. You don't drive the sense of certainty from a permanent possession and immaterial goods, but you drive the sense of a certainty and predictability through relations with others, right? This is what I experienced in my childhood, and we trust each other precisely because we don't have anything. We did not have anything. So therefore, we became trusting agents towards among each other. Yeah. So that I'm afraid I cannot answer the question now. I mean, it's
yeah, no,
systemic, but there are some experiments going on.
Yeah. Great. Well, we received many questions. So I'll start with the question from Christoph. So thanks for the talk. How do you see the comparative potential of the nearby? Has your experience of Oxford and Berlin give you some hints already?
I can't. So about the lockdown, my experience with the lockdown.
No, so how do you see the comparative potential of the nearby? So the comparative potential of the nearby, and and has your experience,
I see.
and your experience in Oxford and Berlin has like gave you some hints already?
Obviously, maybe not obviously, but someone probably know my mobility over the last few months. First of all, I think the comparative value of the nearby will be significant, And the reason it is significant is precisely because the nearby is not a empirically given unit, right? Because if you like compare families, I think it is always very tricky, because the people's definition of family are different, etc. Yet we take family as a kind of established institution. But here, the nearby is a something constructed for a certain purpose. So when we compare the nearby, actually we are compare strategies. We are compare different people's perception of the world, which is driven, of course, by their political economy interest, but also driven by certain goals, purposes. So I think that will be interesting comparison in the broader sense. Again, probably a better word is interreferencing rather than compare, what's the differences or what's the similarity, but to see, okay, why you think of that way and why I think of that way at that time, right? So that would be interesting topic to dialogue, good topic for international conversation. Berlin and Oxford, I haven't thought of that too much because I did not have much chance to explore the nearby in the social sense in Berlin because it's just locked down, right? We did explore physically and very, of course, seriously because we have to go out every day. Yeah, so, but I think Berlin, of course, that's it. I mean, just a quick point. I think that Berlin nearby is much richer than Oxford. Because Oxford is more community. It is very home. I mean, especially the place I used to live in, Oxford, is actually very pretty, very homogeneous, very civilized. But Berlin, being a big city, having so many layers of history, so a bit of like my childhood nearby, there is lots of mixing, lots of dynamics, and there are lots of fragmented history somehow drop on top of each other, kind of have a mosaic of history that create lots of gaps, discrepancies, and surprises. So I think Berlin is definitely more nearby city than Oxford.
Thank you. So we have another question. Good evening. Recently, the camera number in the main street of big cities has increased. So I was wondering, would it influence the public space and nearby, and how?
Oh, the security camera, I mean, it's at the least, I suppose, for nearly 20 years. It's a truly global phenomenon. I mean, people think China has many more, but because of the more population, I don't know the per head count. My impression is that the UK is certainly a pioneer of using a security camera. Public space is gone. I don't know what is public space anymore. All these squares, I mean, if you look at the Chinese case, either they are political space for display or they are completely commercial space for, to sell you something there. And the only people, of course, and people have their own agencies, the elderly, the aunties, and the people slightly younger than my mother's generation. I mean, my mother also does that. To dance, Chinese older ladies dance in the public square. And at that moment, that is a public square. And of course, children run away. But that the public space, I think, is no longer there. And I'm afraid, if you look at the Cairo, public space is being privatized. And they are all very strictly surveillanced and surveilled and commercialized. So the idea to claim back the public space and launch a political movement or social movement through public space, through the notion of the public, for me is no longer feasible. And so therefore it's a wonderful question. So I feel that the nearby is actually more important, especially for, again, a country like in Asia, So it's not like things becoming very bad. Huh? So there's the no, I mean, no explicit hunger, etc. So the nearby, they're kind of more step by step, incremental, and change the mindset, change everyday interactions. Actually, probably is more feasible path for changes.
Thank you. So another question says, you mentioned that the resistance is hard to specialize in urban China, and also showed your cooperation with artists. Do you think exhibition as a form could be the next possible arena to devise, specialize, and express the resistance and the social critique? Could participatory exhibition possibly reconstruct the nearby among communities? So it's like
Yeah, I
a
was
loaded
thinking
question. Yeah,
yes, no, wonderful. I mean, I feel that so lucky. It's my ideal
yeah, yeah.
interlocutors, about politics, art, and ethnography altogether. A participatory exhibition has been experimented in China, like Shenzhen, and I don't have. I mean, I did not haven't done any field research on that, but I believe that the potential is there. And you know that the community work now become a new profession in China. There's a kind of specialist community workers. And I asked, oh, how do you earn your money? They earn money either because the real estate companies will hire them. They wanted to make it's more lively and etc. And all the government will hire them to deliver services to elderly or to children, child care, and etc. I mean, of course, these are different from my idea of nearby, but the potential is there. And these community workers, I mean, they contacted me precisely because they want to do more than this kind of commissioned work by real estate companies or government. So this kind of the desire of participation is certainly there. Whether or not exhibition as a form could be next arena to devise, spatialize, and express resistance, the social critique. I think exhibition is very important because exhibition is a way to train our eyes. And this is why, the Chinese government set up so many museums over the last decade. It's always the battlefield, a battle over our eyes, right? So now nearby is a new battlefield, new front line. And I think our eyes also is a very important battlefield.
Mm.
So yeah, and it's not direct, of course. The exhibition itself is not an action, but it can be important starting point.
Mm. Yeah, we've received many questions. We're gonna try to go through all of them. So another question says, when we discuss the nearby and the neighborhood, how should we envision the social relations embedded in the nearby?
So the nearby social relations, uh, I'm not sure the word embed is a very accurate one. I mean, the embeddedness probably is better associated with the community. There is a kind of a stable structure and norms. So therefore, actions are embedded in something more or less stable as a base. For me, nearby is more like a stage or platform. It is open, it's a stage. So it's like a play, a theater. So many social forces, as I said, the histories, diverse histories come together, often in a surprising way. They play out on the stage in an entangled manner, right? So I would not emphasize, I mean, the salon, the hair salon owner, 51-year-old, divorced from Northeast China, now came with loans and her own savings to open a hair salon next to you. I mean, is your relation with her embedded in anywhere? No, but you encounter here. Two lives, many lives converge together here. So probably that is more the line that I would envision what the social relations in nearby look like in opposition to the embeddedness model of community. Yeah.
Thank you. So do you think that the nearby concept is related to theories of observation of everyday life developed by George Pierce, Descartes, and Lefebvre?
Ah, yes, of course. I'm very bad with theories, so but the Lefebvre is important for me, right? His idea of space of representations versus representations of space. In China, we know the representation of space is overwhelming. Everything, perfect geometry, glittering, very smooth, shiny, rationalized space, abstract map. The real space look like exactly same as the map. You don't need a translation between map and the reality anymore, because the reality looks as neat as a map in many parts of the city. So therefore, that is Lefebvre's, this is the representation of space or conceived space. Then opposite to that is what he called the space of representation, is a lived space that you invest meaning and symbols. Is a space where concrete understanding, informal knowledge about the life emerge. So the nearby is literally, I mean, the space of representation in Lefebvre's sense. But except that Lefebvre says, okay, the space of representation refuse to acknowledge power. This I'm not sure, because in today's world, especially in China, you can't refuse acknowledge power. The idea of the nearby is actually to train you to see how different types of power play out, to see the hidden mechanism of power. So this is why we have to see the interconnections and as well as differences between people's lives. I mean, you cannot ignore the role of power, and you also have to learn to dance with the power. So yeah, the observationalism is absolutely, I mean, if you go to the art part, I mean, this here I wanted to, of course, bring in some art movement in China, like the 6th generation of filmmaking, with basically observationalism, minimum intervention. I mean, there's lots of questions can be asked. Why do people become interested in this now in China? So there is a demand. There is a demand for this type of work. You know, pay attention to the everyday life. But there's one point I want to emphasize again. But this kind of language, like everyday life, ordinary people, community, now nearby, are being very, very frequently used by these online platform giants. So I'm now constantly approached by these big companies as well, because they say, okay, we should talk about that as well. And that is very interesting to observe. Is that, as I said, is this a way that the capital really want to capture our attention 100%? Because we know that the platform company needed to capture people in order to make money. Capture people means capture our everyday activities, capture our nearby, capture our attention 100%. So are they helping us to pay attention to the nearby, or are they further reprogramming the nearby as well as reprogramming ourselves as a source of data, as a source of profit, as a source of a means of production and the subject of extraction? So that is a question to be observed. We're now a bit of early, but pay attention. So therefore the language of nearby, everyday, and etc. have to be used quite carefully. This is what I mean. It is now front line, a battlefield. Many forces are here. Huh?
Okay, so another question about the concept of the nearby in, you know, the difference between Europe and China. So, oh, sorry, yeah. So, do you think, in a way, nearby, in the sense of European version, didn't disappear or reprogrammed as what happened in China, at least to that degree? What are the major differences then? So between
I cannot answer this question because Europe is huge, right? I said that UK, I mean, if you have this mining town in Wales, Scotland, and then you have London, and you have a small town like Oxford, and also Eastern Europe is very different from the West part. Yeah, Overall, it's a very, but I think some in the future, some comparison like between China and Japan or South Korea, big cities, that can be interesting. Yeah. And in this regard, I mean, we really need to learn from each other. I mean, if we take Europe as a kind of a shorthand, that kind of a feeling in China, there is no history left. Everything is fragmented. Everyone are thrown into a new community, right? For me, actually, it's very alienating, but it's also interesting because it is very clear that every day cannot be taken for granted. There is no givenness. So if you go back to the phenomenology discussion, there is no givenness. All the givenness every day is created anew. So, so everyone now have to become constructivist, the one in everyday life. So that spirit could be interesting to, we kind of idealize the European cities where we are still thinking, okay, how we can, protect, but at the same time modify the given history, given tradition, etc. Yeah. So the kind of ruthless energy coming from Asia for me is quite interesting. Sorry.
Thank you. So another question, there is an infrastructure rush in the world today, hospitals, airports, smart cities, and they destroy the old boundaries to create new ones. So the question is, do you think we can apply nearby as a scale of seeing? So in this regard, so there are emergent activities and sociabilities surrounding them. In this regard, do you think we can apply nearby as a scale of seeing?
I do think so. Of course, I mean, we need to look at the specific examples. All this infrastructure building, for example, I think probably this friend is thinking, can we conceive the highway, bullet as a bullet, high speed railway as a nearby, because it's literally the commuting, it's a distance wise is very long, but actually the amount of time that you need to travel across the space is relatively short. Can we conceive that as nearby? I said, I would think yes. And I would suggest that like a railway platform, a railway station can be conceived as nearby. I mean, not for the people, for the actors themselves, but for the researchers. For example, we could go there sorry, not as nearby, that's another way, as a scale of seeing, right? You go to the platform and across certain period of time to see who went through that platform, where do they go, and of course you have to use data from the railway company itself, and probably then you can see how this kind of fleeting relations are created, etc. That's not a nearby, but certainly can be methodologically a scale of seeing that will tell us how this very high level mobility is organized, right? What is infrastructure? Infrastructure is to organize mobility. Infrastructure create new nearby in some sense, but I think a main emphasis would probably they're still not creating nearby, but they can create a new scale of seeing. Yeah.
So we're receiving some very rich reflections mixed with questions. So I'm gonna just briefly ask you this. So do you think the nearby is a spatial or temporal idea?
It is a spatial. I want to emphasize that because because I want to make it a kind of social movement. So it's you have to give a quite a clear empirical contour, a shape, a physical shape. Otherwise people it's a very floating idea. So the physicality of nearby is very important. It's basically some place that you can walk there. It's walkable. Within 15 minutes or 20 minutes, then just pay very fine attention to this place and see the diversity and differences. And of course, you will become interested in history. As I mentioned, where did the peasants like 20 years ago here with the farmland, where did they go? And how the factories next door became bankrupt and then sold and became a shopping mall, and how did that happen? The nearby is always historically formed, but typically formed not in a continuous and historical flow, right? It is always a fragmented, ruptured history. So therefore, this history must be appreciated, understood through the spatial lens. So yeah, it is a spatial concept. Though history is important, but the history also come in through spatial lens, rather than history itself as an agency here.
So another question, how might we think of the nearby through notions of anticipation, especially vis-a-vis COVID-19? Yeah, that's it.
Anticipation?
Yeah, so I mean, so the person asking is saying, I was wondering about the idea of seeing versus that of anticipation in relation to the nearby. So when a carpenter, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anticipation. Okay. Yeah. Anticipation and the propensity. I mean, the carpenter may be no good example because it's a. I don't know actually. I don't know whether Aristotle was more emphasizing the propensity of the material itself, or he was more emphasizing the agency of the carpenter. I mean, let's say it's not from Aristotle. I'm more thinking of John Berger. You know, you must see the picture before you draw anything. Anticipation for me, I think a propensity is an interesting idea. Is that you see, you see things have not there yet, but it's not a fantasy, right? So you see the things is becoming. The thing to come actually is to recognize propensity, is recognize a potentiality. Whether or not this can be used, described as anticipation in English language, and my English is not good enough to judge. I thought anticipation is slightly passive. Is that you does not emphasize you play with the propensity, therefore you craft the future, right? Anticipation is that you are predicting something may happen. I don't know. Yeah, here I think definitely seeing has something to do with propensity, has something to do with imagination. Yeah, has something to do with yeah.
I don't know if you have a couple of minutes just to answer just quickly, maybe, or because we should. Yeah, so I mean, yeah. So just a quick question: is social mobility related to the existence of nearby and its disappearance?
Social mobility is related, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing here is that is not antithetical to nearby. Remember, I emphasize my childhood nearby as a place of fluidity, as a place created by migrants. And of course, the second example, the migrant community, they are the nearby becomes so generative precisely because there are migrants. They open their eyes, they see something the local residents could not see, all the gap, etc. Right? So they energize the nearby. So social mobility is a welcomed force for constructing nearby.
I think this answers to our the question that's asking, is it possible that your neighborhood descriptions were romanticized by childhood memories? Does a child see the nearby differently than an adult?
Absolutely, that is quite likely. And nearby as a skill of seeing, actually, to some extent, is like a child learning the world. You know, you see what you see instead of seeing through some categories or assumptions. But nevertheless, I'm here is not to say there is such a condition of living there. I mean, that is not the main argument. The main argument is that there's such a way of learning about society. I mean, of course, it is my childhood way of learning, but nevertheless, I think methodologically, I think it's relevant and valuable probably today.
I think your answers kind of covered other questions, but maybe we can end with this one last question because we've taken so much of your valuable time. So do you think is there any potential connections between Harvey's urban common and the concept of the nearby as an alternative possibility of the city that is outside the predefined system?
Could be in the long term, but I don't think it, it is less radical than a common. Again, I think Harvey's critique of urban society is very much driven by his observation of quite a stark, obvious contradictions in urban society, especially in the US, and which is strong enough for mobilizing certain collective actions, which condition does not exist in China, I'm afraid. So the nearby is a much less radical step. Is just to train our eyes rather than to create a common, to change property relations and to change the basic system of how resources are created or distributed. Not to that extent at all. Yeah. But all I want to do now is some exhibitions and articles and conversations at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, with that, I think we should end our session. Thank you very, very much, Biao, for such an interesting and lively discussion. Unfortunately, we couldn't, respond to all the questions, but it was such a rich. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we will see you in person in Cambridge, maybe soon.
It's nearby of
Yeah.
Cambridge. Yes.
Soon. Yeah. And
I will read all the messages, and anyone, if anyone is interested in having email discussion, you're very welcome.
Yeah, because kind of the conversation branched out to so many related themes and such interesting approaches. So also the session will be recorded. So the session will be recorded and shared after the end of the city seminar. And see you in our session next week on the 2nd of March with Carl Dorati. And thank you all for attending. And thank you again, Biao.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.